This is a show you will like. You must like this show. It is patriotic to like this show. It is bad thinking not to like this episode of this show. Bad thinking is punishable. I'm trying to be Orwellian. Because people use the adjective Orwellian to describe everything now. I had a very Orwellian sandwich for lunch. I think there's some Orwellian things going on with my car right now. I'm going to bring it into the shop. We're going to talk about George Orwell for real. And we're going to talk about the impact his work continues to have.
Sex, crime.
Pulling together music for a show about George Orwell it's to encounter an embarrassment of riches. There are so many songs that I couldn't use today because we're only using 5. I'm not using Big Brother by Stevie Wonder. And I think that's kind of on point in terms of the conversation we're about to have, because Orwell never goes out of style. You don't dust off 1984 because it doesn't have enough time to gather any dust. We seem to be constantly in conversation with this writer, with 2 of those works in particular. Today, we're going to talk a lot about the writer and the works. Towards the end, you'll also meet somebody who took one of the characters from 1984 and made her the center of a novel. But we're going to begin with DJ Taylor, writer, critic, and author of many books, including Orwell, The New Life, and Who is Big Brother? A Reader's Guide to George Orwell, and Laura Beers, professor of history at American University, and the author of Orwell's Ghost, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. So let's begin with DJ Taylor. This is probably an unanswerable question, or a question that can't be answered briefly anyway. But, there are an awful lot of writers, starting with Huxley, who is sort of, I think, a mentor, or at least Eton master for Orwell. A lot of writers who've written about dystopia. A lot of writers who have beheld situations as they are and wondered how they might get a lot worse and have written compellingly about it. And yet it does feel as though Orwell is at minimum first among equals, if not in a class by himself. Any theory as to why that is? Why is he the one we keep turning to?
Well, it's curious, isn't it? It's very good to be on your show, by the way. Great to be here all the way, floating in all the way over the ether from England. Orwell was a great fan of dystopian novels. He read lots of them, and he wrote interestingly about them before he came to write 1984. And I think this kind of primed him. He had a knowledge of how the genre worked. And then when he began to write 1984, which was a direct response to the world situation as he saw it in the 1940s, and he got the idea from the Tehran Conference of 1943, where Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin more or less divided up the post-war world. And this gave him, given then all his speculations about technology and the perversion and manipulation of language, which lies at 1984's core, it gave that book became, I suppose, a kind of universal signifier, which goes on reinventing itself and being used in new ways. I was particularly struck by this when here in England, when we saw Elon Musk coming in by video link to the big right-wing nationalist demonstration we had here in September. And of course, he was wearing a "What Would Orwell Have Thought" T-shirt, which I thought was both terrifying and very kind of prescient and pertinent at the same time.
Yes, and Laura, to David's point, that term Orwellian gets thrown about. I mean, here in this country, a person who seems to make frequent use of it is, of all people, Donald Trump Jr., who likes to say that the way that his father is being treated is Orwellian. As opposed to the outrages perpetrated by his father being Orwellian. And I guess it's kind of maybe an all-purpose tool that you can use to complain about what the other side is doing.
I mean, I think you're 100% right. And part of the logic in writing this, writing Orwell's Ghost, was thinking about how we should understand Orwell in our modern era, because he is really the term Orwellian is loosely thrown around by both sides in our current political debate. As you say, Donald Trump Jr., who first came out and claimed the deplatforming of his father after January 6th, when he was temporarily removed from Twitter, was Orwellian thought policing, or Elon Musk, who regularly, claims the mantle of Orwellian freedom as he understands it against what he sees as a kind of woke culture that is trying to silence voices like his, on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have, the growing number of voices that are calling out the excesses of the current Trump administration as Orwellian, as totalitarian, as about this kind of cult of the personality. I don't know if you've heard, but Trump is going to put his face on U.S. passports effective next year.
I
The
think
image
you.
of
I
our
think you
leader
have to.
is everywhere.
Yeah, I think you have to choose that, though. I don't think we all get stuck with them. I think it's like a
Well,
special.
unfortunately, I'm zooming in here, not from as far away from David, but from Washington, D.C., where I think I have to actively work to ensure that when I renew my son's passports next year, they'll be done out of a different office. But um, yes, but I mean, you see both sides basically using this author to antithetical ends. And I think that's because, on the one hand, he stands for free speech, and he does oppose censorship. But on the other hand, he stands for, a kind of responsible democratic politics and against the corruption of politics through kind of this tyrannical will to power. And those two things can often come into conflict.
Yes, and David, to go back to your earlier point too. I mean, one reason it gets brought up a lot is because life is oddly Orwellian. I mean, and certainly since the 1950s, the first time it became popular, this book goes back onto the bestseller list with some regularity. It did here in this country after 9/11 and the Patriot Act. Even if you go back to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was sometimes referred to as Big Brother. Certainly here in the U.S., when Kellyanne Conway started talking about alternative facts, which just seems very, very 1984. Once again, the book's back on the bestseller list. It's, whether it's Edward Snowden or, I mean, and maybe part of this is, I'm going to say this again later on the show, Orwell wrote this book about the way he saw things. Huxley writes his book about the way things are going to be in 2540 or whatever year it is there. I mean, Orwell's idea is that people would be reading this book in 1984. So maybe it's not that surprising that it seems to resemble the present.
I think that's a very good point. I also agreed with Laura's point about what Orwell actually stood for, which is he certainly believed in freedom of speech, but he believed in liberty rather than license, to make that distinction. But to go back to your point, the enduring relevance was, as you say, he wrote it. I mean, when published in 1949, it was seen certainly by its English readers living in war-torn Great Britain, as a very contemporary book. Although set in 1984, they could see its landscapes when they looked out of the window, and he was very careful to kind of transfer some of the places in bombed-out London into the places that were then at large in 1984. But the Orwellian, as I would define it, and I imagine Laura would probably too, tends to mean three things. It means surveillance technology that's got out of control. It means the denial of objective truth, and it means the manipulation of language, in the case of 1984, through Newspeak, the artificial language of Oceania. And all these things seem as perpetually relevant 76, 77 now, years after it was published, now as they did then. And the consequence of that is that, to say, Orwell, like one or two other famous international writers, but I think probably more so even than them, has kind of floated off in a world far beyond the original text that he wrote, whereby he's kind of sort of he's entered the consciousness of people on both sides of the Atlantic who may not actually read anything he'd written, but they kind of know about him at second hand in the way that certainly a bygone generation would know about the novels of Charles Dickens at second hand. That's how successful and influential he's got, I think, all these years after his death.
What David just said, Laura, is also, I think, part of the risk, and the risk of co-optation in particular. And I think, you think about Razak's work and Marcuse, who they talk about these. Somebody comes up with a countercultural idea or an idea that's seems to challenge authority. Authority is very quick to try to grab this and make use of it. And we've seen some pretty bizarre examples of this. Laura, I think, I don't know if you remember it as vividly as I do, but Apple in 1984 did a one-time ad, believe it was in the Super Bowl, called 1984, then showed this British athlete throwing a sledgehammer through a screen that Big Brother was on. And you think about that now, Apple, the working conditions in China and the Apple factories are very big brothery, and certainly the idea that we would be willing to pay money, quite a bit of money, to have a device that we carry in our pockets, which is capable of, first of all, transmitting propaganda right to us, but also surveilling us, and that somehow or other Apple managed to use Orwell to celebrate the launch of such a product. You start to realize, and just to say one other thing based on what David was saying about people who might not know the work, people all over the world are much more likely, I think, to know Big Brother from the reality show that has aired on all continents except Antarctica in a way that's completely severed from Orwell. But I do, Laura, wonder about that idea of co-optation, that idea that you could just make a product about George Orwell when it was kind of really about the opposite of him.
Well, I mean, I think in some ways, Big Brother is, this idea that this surveillance culture can be a form of entertainment, right? I mean, and the title Big Brother from the reality television program, in which you basically are watching people live their lives in a fish tank, is a reference to Orwell, but it's being served up as a kind of much more Aldous Huxley type opiate for the masses, right? It's kind of lulling people into a sense of complacency through mind-numbing television, as opposed to posing this kind of existential risk to people's freedom of thought and action. And I think the irony, I think this speaks to one of the things that maybe Orwell didn't quite foresee as presciently as some things. But the irony now of that Super Bowl ad, and the Super Bowl was the one time in my early life I was allowed to stay up past my bedtime, right? So this is an ad I saw when it first aired. I mean, in some ways it was ironic at its time, because it's you have this woman who is breaking the screen of what is effectively IBM, right? The big supercomputer, and liberating people through the much more portable home Apple IIe, which is going to then, kind of liberate them from the tyranny of IBM. And now it's Apple that's become, one of the major tech companies. But it is Apple, as you say, that's also surveilling us. And state surveillance does remain an issue, right? But the kind of state surveillance that Orwell, predicted in 1984 is really, it's the state that's doing the surveilling. And now, in that we're being surveilled, it is largely private corporations, right? And they're often fighting with the government about whether they give them this very valuable commodity, which is this, very nitty-gritty information that they have collected on us, that they're collecting on us every minute. I mean, I'm sure we've all had that experience of having a conversation, in real life with someone, and an hour later looking at our phone and we get an advertisement for whatever we were talking about, because your phone is always listening.
Or seconds later.
Yes, or
why
seconds later.
Why wait an hour for something like that? Yeah, no, another great thinker, Ann Landers, once said, nobody can take advantage of you without your permission. And the number of things that we've given our permission for is, I think, alarming. And as you say, probably more Huxleyan, that we're entertaining ourselves to death here. David, one thing that kind of came up for me this time around with Orwell, we think about all the things that you've just talked about and that Laura's just talked about. for me, the issue of humiliation came up more. And I think Orwell might have even had said at some point, you would absolutely know this, David, that in his ideal Britain would never be humiliated and would never humiliate anybody else. And that what you see, I think, in his fiction is the power of humiliation to compel obedience. I hadn't really noticed it so much before, but it really is unsettling, I think, the way he uses the idea of humiliation. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's a very interesting point, actually. It's certainly at the heart of 1984 because it's about people's subjection and the very complex relationship between the powerful and the powerless, or sometimes the less powerful. And I think Orwell's psychological touch in terms of power relationships is often underestimated. Just to change the text slightly, I've just been doing some work on Animal Farm for a book I've got coming out next year. And one of the most interesting things about Animal Farm is the relationship between the pigs and the subordinate animals, because you think to yourself all the time, how could the non-pigs be so credulous as all this is going on, as the rules keep getting changed, as the grain supplies diminish, as as liberty after liberty is taken with their own personal freedom in the interest of this fake communality that exists. And in the end, there has to be a degree of complicity between Orwell's oppressed and the people who are doing the oppressing. And the way in which he explores this, I think, both in Animal Farm and in 1984 is very interesting and probably stems, I would imagine it goes all the way back to the power relationships that he had himself witnessed and participated in when he worked for the British Raj in Imperial Burma in the 1920s. So, as with most of what he wrote, and I'd be interested to see what Laura thinks of this, it's very much bound up with his own personality and his own psychology and the way in which he saw the world.
Laura, you chime right in there, please.
I just finished reading. I managed to get shipped from the UK. There isn't one in the US, an illustrated version of Animal Farm, which I read as a bedtime story to my 9-year-old, and we just finished it the other day. And that why don't the other animals do something? Like, can't they see? Was like he would just every night he'd get really up in arms about it. And there is this tragic moment in the last chapter when clearly they do see, right? Like they're credulous, but they do, they're not so mindless as not to realize that the 7 commandments are entirely gone and what's left is just all animals are equal, but some animals are equal than others. But at that point, like Winston Smith at the end of 1984, they are broken, right? But then the question is, they arguably had more agency than Winston does, given that they outnumber the pigs significantly, right? At earlier points to attempt to resist. And you see these moments when the hens do attempt their sort of, brief resistance, but they're brutally suppressed. And I actually think that 1984 and his essays on his own time in Burma are much better at kind of exploring what makes people not rise up than Animal Farm. And partly because, as he says, it's a fairy story. It's simplified. It's for children. But there are moments where you just think in Animal Farm, there is no, I think, sophisticated analysis in that book of why it is that they don't use the agency that they have, other than the character of Benjamin, whose kind of cynicism stops him from acting. And I think that is something he does very well, particularly in his essays about his time in Burma, where, as David says, he's very, very conscious of the way that people become complicit in the imperial system, including the non-Anglo-Indian population.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to quickly interject that apropos of Animal Farm. None of us have seen this movie, but there's apparently kind of a family-friendly comedy coming out, and there's even a change.org petition right now to block. It's very quixotic, I think, but to try to block this from coming out. That it's directed by Andy Serkis, and it just sounds like he didn't really understand or something. But I just want to go back to Burma for a second, David, because this is something that I've been thinking about also over the last few days, partly because I live in Mark Twain's city. And I've always thought, apropos of Twain, that one reason that he's more compelling than someone who just had good-hearted and noble objections to things like slavery is that he recognized demons in himself. He knew what it was like to live with those demons. And I wondered if that applies when I think about the Burma, in British police stuff. I wonder if that makes any sense to you in terms of Orwell. One of the reasons that maybe he crackles with more energy and electricity than somebody who just has, pure motives and noble objections is because he knows what it's like to get a little more power than you would have had if you stayed in England and lived in your class station there. How tempting it is, really, to get that power and do something with it.
I think that's right. I mean, he said of the Canadian writer Jack London, by whom he was very influenced, and London himself wrote a dystopia called The Iron Heel, by which Orwell was very influenced. And he said of London that the reason he understood fascism was because he had a fascist streak in himself. And I think that to a certain extent could be applied to Orwell. He was honest enough to admit that, in some ways he got, there were parts of being an imperial officer that he didn't mind. It was in his family tradition and his heritage. And it's often thought, I suppose one of the Orwell myths, which I've always myself tried to deflate, is the idea that he came home from Burma in 1927 because he was disgusted with the imperialism he served, and he wanted to fight against the Raj, and he completely kind of changed his political views. But in some ways, it's a lot more complicated than that. Orwell came home from Burma with an engagement ring in his trunk, which he wanted to present to a young woman he knew in England, and she turned him down. But had she said yes, my own view is that he'd have gone straight back to Burma and carried on being an imperial civil servant, because it was the only job he knew. And so it is his relationship, I suppose, with the imperial power that he served in the 1920s is a lot more complicated than it sometimes looks on the surface when you look at the individual compartments of Orwell's life. And he certainly had what we might call a slightly sort of sadistic streak in himself. But I think that gave him an understanding of the way in which power corrupts the people who are exercising it.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here. We have more to say, much more to say after this, so stay with us. DJ Taylor and Laura Beers will be back.
Wingless angels stroll atop shapeless cotton balls with halos in disarray. Celestial ground is found exposed in a bottomless depth, where heartless spawns await to devour the small piece of your soul that's you're immersed in sound, floating, aimless destination. Drop anchor to gain stability, sterile potions restrain fertility. Pedestal talk is a token soaked in pockets where lives topics lack conceptual ridicule. I'll stand on my own too, with aura illuminated in red, showcasing the agony held within this welded spirit. Sacrificing itself for the health of a masochistic culture, yearning for the truth that we speak but refuse to hear it.
Platforms have been erected, effigies built, sliding coin, songs have been written, rumors have been circulated, photographs faked, the hourglass smashed and didn't leave me in escape. Music boxes have been worn out, measuring, dusted, idols idolized, fans have been recycle my consciousness. Just a note for every action, lack thereof, the hourglass smashed, there's a consequence.
I'm sure you've read all of George Orwell's works, like Keep the Aspidistra Flying, with all your thoughts and all your quirks. Well, you're just mystifying.
I told you there were a lot of George Orwell songs. All right, we are talking George Orwell today with DJ Taylor, writer, critic, author of many books, including Orwell, The New Life, and Who is Big Brother? A Reader's Guide to George Orwell. Laura Beers, professor of history at American University and the author of Orwell's Ghost, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. So, Laura, obviously, yes, there's 1984, there's Animal Farm, but at some point you probably start, if you're a reader, somebody hands you an Orwell essay, and it's usually politics in the English language. And once again, there's something just unsettlingly unsettlingly familiar about everything that he posits in that essay. I mean, I was thinking today that, Operation Epic Fury seems very Big Brother. So does renaming the Gulf of Mexico in your first day of office, putting your name on buildings and passports, as you suggested. But then I realized that, it wasn't all that long ago that we got, during the time of the Patriot Act, which is also an interestingly chosen piece of wording, the Department of Homeland Security, which I remember thinking at the time seemed kind of Orwell. But it's kind of interesting also, Laura, how these things normalize. It takes about a couple of decades and you just don't even really think about it anymore as this odd way of controlling our thought through vocabulary.
Yes. And I mean, I think politics in the English language is an interesting example because it's an essay that is partly about the kind of obfuscation and intentional misrepresentation in political language. But it's also an essay about writing, right? And clear writing. And actually, when you think about the reasons that people remember it from school, is it's often given to English students and journalism students as a kind of almost a how-to manual about how to write clearly. But he is, in addition to his commitment to not using Latin words, but good solid Anglo-Saxon English, and not using the passive voice, he's also lights into really a lot of his contemporaries at the time, who he saw as defending the indefensible, and particularly the indefensible in terms of the Soviet Union and communism, as members of a left politics, which he was also a member of, but he was very much a member of an anti-communist left, through this obfuscatory language. And so you're right, we see that in things like Operation Epic Fury at least says, does what it says on the tin.
Yes.
I mean, it's unleashing epic fury on Iran. But, these more, euphemistic, like the Department of Homeland Security, which, is it making people more secure, or is it the obverse? And I think that in some ways, Orwell expands on this idea, really well at the end of 1984, in the appendix on Newspeak, when he is talking about how language can be degraded and how the degradation of language can impact not only how people communicate, but how they think. That without language in which to express their ideas, they can't really have this sort of full complexity of thought that they would in a free and democratic society.
David, this goes back, what Laura just said to, I think kind of goes back to a little bit of the conversation that we had before, but certainly here in the U.S., communism and socialism are used interchangeably, especially on social media where nobody is really, holding anybody to account very much. And sometimes communism, socialism, and totalitarianism are used interchangeably. And it might be worth just taking a minute or two to at least work out a little bit of Orwell's thinking about this. I don't think it's quite accurate to say that he was opposed to socialism in all of its manifestations, but you would know better.
Well, you've just reminded me of one of my favorite episodes of The Simpsons, where Lisa says something like, "Don't tell me you've never heard of the author of Animal Farm." And Marge says, "Well, I'm fed up with all these obscure references." And then Bart chimes in with, "Grandpa said he was a commie," which shows what a certain sort of far from marginal area of American political thought actually still thinks of him all these years later. He described himself formally as a democratic socialist with a lowercase d and a big S, and yet if there's the most radical thing he ever wrote was an extended pamphlet published in the early 1940s called "The Lion and the Unicorn: Socialism and the English Genius," in which he actually seems to predict, if not to predict, then welcome the idea of a real English revolution. I mean, he thought that the rifle in the corner of the man who worked who was in the local defence volunteers in England in the 1940s was the equivalent of the musket on the wall in 1776. for the American Revolution. But he then kind of calmed down a bit, and later on in the war, he said he had overestimated the public's appetite for this sort of thing. After which he became what in the UK we would call a gradualist of the left, someone who believes that you achieve social and economic change incrementally rather than by this sudden, eruption of sentiment and politics. But the other interesting thing is that he, when it came to the practicalities of what socialism might mean in terms of how you ran your society and how income might be distributed and how might be redistributed, then it all gets rather vague. And in fact, I think he wrote one article. There are sort of hints here and there when he writes about how much writers ought to get paid, and I think he says at one point, in a properly socialist society, writers would be amongst the higher pay grades, and that's about as far as it gets. I mean, it's much more of a kind of moral crusade, I think, than an actual practical one in terms of sort of serious propositions in terms of how to redevelop a country's economy or a country's institutions or its social systems.
Laura, did you have anything you wanted to? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I mean, he does, in that he has a practical suggestion in The Lion and the Unicorn, right? He says that income should be limited such that the top income should be no more than 10 times the bottom income within society. And when we think about, the incomes of these billionaires, Bezos and Musk and whatnot, versus the people who are on the assembly line or driving the delivery trucks at Amazon, we're clearly not in a world of a kind of 10-to-1 ratio. So he didn't think that everyone should be exactly equal, but he thought that there should be a much more compressed strata than in the UK at the time, and certainly than we have in 21st century society. And I think, though, the other thing that's interesting out of The Lion and the Unicorn is he's advocating for a social revolution. But when he talks about what Britain will look like after that social revolution, just thinking about our recent monarchical visit from King Charles and Camilla to Washington and up to New York and Virginia, he thinks that this will be a revolution in which the monarchy will probably last, because it sort of stands for something, vaguely patriotic and English and unthreatening, and that it will be the House of Lords which will be abolished as representing kind of, power of the landed elite. And actually, we, just finally in the UK, the hereditary peers have finally been booted out of the House of Lords long after Orwell predicted their demise, right? But a lot of these sort of structures of power and the ways that he thinks about them, there is a kind of nostalgic reverence for English society that allows him to reconcile the continued existence of the monarchy with this idea of a social revolution that is going to lead to, if not, full-on communism, this, real, equality that was much greater than anything, Britain had seen up until that point.
David, I've only got about 30 seconds left here, but I want to sort of button something on to Laura's talk of nostalgia. And that is, I mean, Orwell so much comes down to us as this writer about alienation and dehumanization and totalitarianism. Maybe just for 30 seconds mention his roses and his attention to his trees. I mean,
I actually just planted a new rose bush the other day, and I thought about Orwell's homage to the Woolworths rose. It was not a Woolworths rose. It was,
as far as I'm
significantly more expensive.
One of the great points in his favour is that where he had complaints when he wrote columns about this kind of thing in the left-wing magazine Tribune, and Marxist critics would say of him that roses are bourgeois, and if you ever wanted a kind of something that shows you some of the inadequacies of the far left in British and American politics, that is it.
All right, we have to stop there. You have been both wonderful, wonderful guests. Thank you so much for lending me your time today. DJ Taylor and Laura Beers will be back with more after this.
Stirring up the dirt, always have clean shirts to play around in.
Everywhere there's lots of piggies living piggy lives. You can see them out for dinner with their piggy wives, clutching forks and knives to eat the bacon.
Time to say some thank yous. We'll start with our technical producer, Dylan Reyes, the maestro. Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions has made this particular episode possible, thanks to her or them, or it's like Big Brother. It's not entirely clear to me who Lily Tyson really is. And special thanks to James Tookie, who I was hanging around in New York with this past weekend, and on Sunday, he just plopped this very book on my lap and said, "You should be reading this book right now." And this book is Julia by Sandra Newman. And I said to James, "Did you know I'm doing a George Orwell show this week?" And he did not. It all just worked out great. So we're going to talk to Sandra Newman right now. Her novel is Julia, a novel. It is a telling of the 1984 story, but from the perspective of one of the other characters, the quote-unquote love interest of Winston Smith. Sandra Newman, first of all, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Colin. Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So, here's a quote from George Orwell. He says, when I sit down to write a book, I do not say to myself, I am going to produce a work of art. I write it because there is some lie that I want to expose, some fact to which I want to draw attention, and my initial concern is to get a hearing. I thought about that quote reading Julia because I was wondering whether that's a little bit of the impulse for you to get Julia a hearing, that Julia is maybe not fully developed in the original. Were you trying to get her a hearing?
Yeah, well, you can sort of see in the original, he's trying to get a hearing for a set of ideas. And so, fleshing out that character is not the most important thing to George Orwell. And so the character of Julia she's a bit of an NPC or a non-player character. She's sort of a projection of Winston's needs or of Orwell's needs in order to get his message across. And she doesn't actually become a fully embodied human being. And I think for a lot of female readers and probably some male readers, that's been a bit of an obstacle to reading the book over the years. I've certainly met a lot of those people in talking about Julia publicly who were maybe not unable to finish the book, but unable to fully engage with the book because the character of Julia really kind of bothered them and soured them on the book.
And this is a project you undertook with the approval of the Orwell estate. Maybe say a little bit about how that exchange went.
So I was approached by the Orwell estate, actually. It was originally their idea. And it's an idea that I think has been in the minds of a lot of Orwell people over the years. When you're reading 1984, I think for two reasons. One reason is that there's something about the character Julia that has made a lot of critics over the years wonder if her story, the story she tells to Winston, is true, or if she was working for Big Brother all along. So that's one of the reasons, is actually that in the book, there's the seed planted, the seed of doubt about Julia. Is she on the level? Is she for real? And there are a lot of reasons to think she might not be. And so it feels like kind of a loose end. And we remember that Orwell was actually dying when he wrote 1984. He was rushing to finish this, to get it to press, because he thought it was a very important book, and he knew he might not survive to finish it. So some of the loose ends in 1984, they're not, they might have been things that Orwell would have tied off if he had had the time. And I feel personally, my hunch is that that's one of them, that he had more to that character that he never got to develop. So that's one thing. And the other thing is just that a lot of people had actually, feminist writers had approached the Orwell estate wanting to write this book, 1984 from the point of view of Julia. And for one reason or another, Bill Hamilton, who represented the estate, was not confident that Orwell's legacy.
Oh, a little freeze here.
Their project was, but he was never completely satisfied with any of the projects. But then it came to a point where 1984 was coming out of copyright, and he would no longer be able to control who wrote this book. So there was a sort of a panic about that, and he thought, well, I should find somebody who I trust to write this book so that it will be the book of this kind that will represent 1984 from the point of Julia. And at that point, he came to me.
There's a lot of, I think, difference of tone, maybe isn't exactly the right word, between your novel and Orwell's novel. And what I want to focus on for a second is Julia. Well, maybe we could back up and say, Orwell's focus is so much on this horrible, oppressive, humiliating, sterile dystopian state that there's not a lot of room for what we might call earthiness But there is in your novel, Julia is quite earthy. I mean, she's literally earthy. She tells us that she likes to have sex outdoors with her butt on the dirt. Uh, so, I mean, I think one of the pleasures of this book, if pleasure is the right word, is that it is somewhat interested in pleasure, interested in how you find joy in the little cracks and interstitial spaces of a dystopian state. See a little bit about your approach to all that, how you thought or felt about it.
Yeah, well, I think Orwell, when he wrote Winston Smith, I mean, there's a lot to Winston Smith. He's kind of a complicated character in a lot of ways, so I won't get too far into that because that's not your question. But Winston is somebody who actually has been kind of stunted by totalitarianism, and he's not able to come to terms with it. At the end, he has to be crushed before he can be a part of totalitarianism. Julia is not like that in 1984 or in my book. She's somebody who grew up with totalitarianism, and she's a native. So she's figured out ways to get the things that human beings want and need within totalitarianism. And I think that's something that most people who live in totalitarian societies do. They make their peace with it. They get used to it. They repeat the slogans, and they still they sneak out and get whatever they want. Like in Julia's case, she's buying chocolate and various things like on the black market, and she's going and managing to have love affairs, which is completely verboten in the society. And she's kind of a happy-go-lucky person despite the world around her. And she's that in 1984, and I've sort of made her shown that from the inside in my book. And I think that's sort of a truth about totalitarianism, which Orwell touched on, but he didn't have time to elaborate. And I'm very interested in that, as somebody actually managed to get to the Soviet Union just before it broke up. So, I have some experience of that sort of the tail end of that sort of society where people have figured out ways of bending every possible rule. So, the society is two things at once, and it's kind of no longer makes sense.
What you were saying about Winston Smith before brings up another interesting question, because we haven't said the word misogyny yet, but it does come up in connection with Orwell. It arguably is kind of mostly the misogyny of neglect. He kind of just neglects to make Julia whole and real as she could be. But I think it's also a fair question to ask how much of that is Orwell and how much of that is Winston Smith. Winston Smith arguably is a character who himself would not be able to maybe see another person, especially a woman, in full flower. Maybe say a little bit about that. I mean, Orwell's got his issues, but I wonder how much of this is Smith's actual damage, the way that he responds to Julia.
Yeah, well, I think 1984 is a really interesting book when you start thinking about it through that lens, because Orwell talks a lot about misogyny in the book, and he sort of ascribes the misogyny of Winston subtly, sort of implicitly, to the totalitarianism repressive society that he's living in. It's like Winston has been made an incel by the society. He's not able to have a normal, intimate life with a woman, and therefore he resents and hates women. That is the story told in 1984. And that doesn't leave, since we're seeing everything through Winston's eyes, that doesn't leave much room for Julia to come across as an individual. He can't see her fully, even though she's clearly a much freer subject than he is. She's able to do all these things and get away with all these things and live in this society without ever taking it seriously. He doesn't take her seriously, and he's not able to listen to her and learn from her. And arguably that's why both of them are doomed. But anyway, I think what's interesting about it, I think, is that it really is true that Orwell was a misogynist in some ways, or at least there was a girlfriend of his who said that she didn't think he hated women. He just thought they weren't important. So make of that what you will. But he certainly, in 1984, he shows signs of being intimately familiar with what it feels like to be a misogynist. And he writes about it really well and really convincingly. And I think that's part of the book, misogyny as a result of repression, misogyny as actually even like a tool of state control, you could say. It was a way of splitting people apart and making it impossible for people to have nourishing connections.
One of the interesting things that Orwell does with 1984 is write a book that he won't live to that year, but a lot of his readers will live to that year. I mean, Huxley's Brave New World is set in like 2540 or something, and future dystopias often are. He just goes a few decades out, and I think reading Julia. You kind of have the same feeling that we're in the future, but not much in the future. So many things in the, even early in the novel, she, a kind of a fighter pilot, takes her up in his plane and they fly near or around the Crystal Palace of Big Brother. And it just sounds very Trump Tower. It's like this, gaudily, showily, palace. Just say a little bit about that. How all this stuff never really feels rooted or located so much in the future as like tomorrow, maybe.
Yeah, Orwell was definitely writing a book that was about his time. It's one of these near future sort of science fiction novels that is entirely political satire about his time, and he wasn't that interested in science fiction world building. He'll come up with a great science fiction idea or science fiction society idea, like his junior anti-sex league, and then he never lets us see the junior anti-sex league. Like, what are their meetings like? What goes on there? So he's not that interested in that. He's really mainly interested in, as you introduced this with, and getting his point across. But I think that's not a criticism. That's the genre of book it is, and it's a way of looking at our society through the kind of the hyperbolic version of it. Although, I think that one of the unpleasant things about writing Julia was that in the time I was writing it, and certainly since I've written it, the world outside has become so much more like the post-truth society in 1984, where we actually don't even know if 1984 is really the year, because anything that we're told is suspect.
Maybe the last question we'll have time for, but one of the mysteries of the original 1984, and one that you have a little bit more time and energy to probe, is why somebody like Julia would be interested in somebody like Winston Smith, who is, old misery, and she is clearly not old misery. Say a little bit about how you thought that whole relationship out. She has lots of other choices. She's had lots of other boyfriends. What is it about him?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things about that answer is that Winston is seeing her through his eyes. So to him, it's almost as if she hasn't had all these other boyfriends, even though she talks about them. She says, "I love you," and he takes that for granted. And the book kind of treats it as if he is the great man in her life. But there's no reason for us to really believe that. They're only together for a few months in the course of the book. So that was really my approach, was to treat that as the reality, that she is seeing him as one in a seemingly endless series of men, and she really doesn't have that many men to choose from. So I think to me it was really like an experience. Her experience of being attracted to him would be an experience that's familiar to anyone who's lived in a small town or been stuck in a sort of a boring job where you see the same people every day. And in order to get through your day, or just in order to have an outlet, romantic or sexual, you find somebody. You've managed to cook up a crush on somebody in the workplace. You develop a fantasy about them. And there's enough in Winston to get her going. And from there, they have this affair.
I mean, even the "I love you" is regifted. I mean, I thought that was kind of hilarious, that the "I love you" turns out to be a note that was passed to Julia by another woman, a woman who has this massive crush on Julia. So I mean, Julia sort of having a good laugh, because if they analyze the handwriting, it's not hers. But also there's something kind of funny, I think, about the idea that it's a regifted note from a woman to Julia.
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, that was because it's a terrible way. Who comes onto someone that way by handing them a note that says "I love you"? It makes no sense. And Orwell was notoriously terrible at approaching women, so I think that's what it comes from. But, I couldn't really work very well with that without coming up with some backstory.
Well, the book is Julia, a novel. It's by Sandra Newman, our guest, and we have been fortunate to have several wonderful other guests also as well. I hope you enjoyed this. It's hard to think about enjoying Orwell. Some of his visions are so bleak, but they also speak to us very powerfully. So thanks for listening today.
You always have been. Sure is gonna be low.